Okay, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, you're in our Atlanta office, looking
Yes.
great. Look at that view. I'm here. People might remember this from the December, January days. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota, where my parents live.
Yep.
I'm enjoying it being about 20 degrees colder than it is in Atlanta. But I do sure miss being in the office with you, Chase, and Sean. So, life is all about trade-offs. How you doing, man?
Man, it is 90 plus degrees. It's one of those hot days. So it's okay. We're not complaining. And you're right. You should enjoy the 20 less. It's funny. We lead in with that music, and all I can imagine you doing, Midwestern guy, Minnesota, Nebraska, playing like just old 80s, 80s, 70s, 80s rock, leading in, air guitar in that riff. Is that why you came up with that one?
It might be actually the guy that made. He's actually been a guest on the show, Matt Collar. He's actually from like the Buffalo, Western New York area, but actually covers Minnesota, lives here in the Twin Cities. So there might be like a little bit of that kind of, kind of go up through Niagara Falls, Toronto, down through Detroit into the Twin Cities kind of vibe to that. I'm not necessarily sure if the music travels in the same way, the genre of the music travels in the same way as the creator, but that's an astute observation. It's been good to get the intro to the show going with a song here because it's nice to get people kind of coming into the room and everything. We got we're live here on Twitter, we're live here on YouTube, we're live here on Twitch. If you're a Twitch person, in any event, subscribe, rate, review the show. We'll talk about that at the end as well, but make sure that you are getting there. We're like 38 days away from the Hall of Fame game, and 70-ish days or so, 80-ish days from week one. I saw the first number. So we're close to the season, man. And like part of me I got to ask your opinion as a former GM, but as an analyst, whenever anybody's like, oh my God, it's Travis Kelce days until the season, they show 87 or something like that. And I'm like, please don't tell. We got all this stuff to do before the season starts, right? And I feel like for you, it's more like you're on vacation this time of year when you're an executive in the league, and you also don't want those days to be coming off the calendar that quickly either. Whereas like I think an average fan, of course, wants week one to come relatively quickly.
It's a great point. No, I don't think most GMs do. They would love to savor this as long as possible, as well as the head coaches, right? They need more time. They need more time, as we talked about, being with their families. Speaking about being with families, what they're doing right now is probably what you're able to do a little bit. Now you're working, just like you made it very clear to me the other day. You were with your family, your parents, right? You were right. Mm-hmm. Are you in the Twin Cities right now?
Yep. I'm in, Maplewood, Minnesota, if anybody wants to come say hi.
Maplewood, Minnesota, with your family, which is great. You guys are probably having some great discussions about all the things you need to discuss. And look, I think most general managers and most head coaches, they need that time. They come back like a vengeance. So, and I can imagine you do too, Eric. I can imagine coming back after you're so excited about it, as I am. We get a little chance to do the things we need to do, of course. But look, it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. Are there going to be any free agent signings? I know you wanted to talk about a couple of them today. I'm sure you want to talk about many more than a couple, but.
Well, what's your opinion? Because you obviously were still. I mean, you were evaluating when Dalvin Cook was drafted in 2017 in the 40s by the Vikings. DeAndre Hopkins was drafted in 2013, kind of in the teens, I want to say, by Houston. So those are two players that you've evaluated before. Those are the two right now in the NFL, like most coveted, if we can even say that, free agents still available. I know we're going to talk about quarterbacks here, but I haven't not gotten your opinion on those because it's interesting. One of the reasons Dalvin Cook was let go by the Vikings was, in my opinion, because he scored poorly in these residual metrics we're going to talk about today for running backs. And, a lot of people don't necessarily think he has what it takes to be a great runner anymore, which is tough because he's not that old. And I think similarly for Hopkins, it's another one of those where age has really been a factor in the evaluation, which is tough because they're not they're not old humans. They're in case Dalvin Cook's like 27 years old. So it's a very rough and tumble world. Like when you look at those two guys being available right now, put yourself in the GM position again. Like what are you thinking when it comes to those players?
Well, I mean, I'd love to talk about each at one time as well. If we could lead in on Dalvin for a minute. By the way, how old is he right now?
I think Dalvin Cook's 27.
Is he 27? Look, I mean, what and the type of money he's looking for, he would love to turn a $10 million a year deal. Is that probably where he would love to be?
Yeah, so Minnesota saved 9 by cutting him post June 1. He had a cap hit in that 13 million range. He signed one of those deals that was so when he signed, there were 2 running backs that were making kind of in that Kamara McCaffrey area, like that 16-ish. And then there were a bunch of running backs. Now I'm going to get the sequencing wrong, but there's a number of running backs like Chubb and Mixon and Cook and guys like that all kind of made in that 12, even Derrick Henry, all in that 12 and a half range. He kind of nestled in right there. And, you know, the Vikings kind of looked at this. They had Alexander Madison, who has been their backup guy, who has been pretty good when he's played. And then they drafted Ty Chandler, a guy from North Carolina who has some good metrics. Dwayne McBride from UAB, another guy, 6th-round pick who does okay. And then they got this guy named Kene Nwangwu from Iowa State, who's actually made a Pro Bowl as a return man, a 4.25 kind of guy, but has very little experience in the backfield. He sat behind Breece Hall when they were both at Iowa State. And so I think Kwesi Adofo-Mensah looks at that backfield and kind of similar to what you've said on this show, Thomas, which is like, do I want to put all the money into this one guy and put all my eggs there, or do I want to sort of spread the risk out between 4 guys, none of whom are as good as Dalvin Cook, but who maybe collectively could be a better bargain for the money?
Look, I want to go on record. I like Dalvin Cook. I think he can still run. I like what he does. I mean, the idea of him potentially going down to Miami outside zone, I love that idea, right? Back to your point as a GM, when you're looking at both Dalvin Cook and D Hop, what are you looking at? I mean, look, what I'm doing is I'm saying there's no way in the world I'm going to pay $10 million a year for you, Cook, and there's no way, Hop, I'm going to be paying what you want, which is close to what? $20 million, $19 million, whatever it is. I mean, there's no way. So you let it settle. If I'm, the rumors about, Miami, the rumors about New England, I let it settle and let him come back down to reality, let their agents come to reality. And it's not that, it's important. Yes, Eric, but given the money, the differential there, it's too big to jump in there in my mind and to start negotiating like crazy. I would not do that. I'd let it settle until it comes down to that time closer to the beginning of the season. And then we can all be more realistic about it.
Well, there's never a player that at this point in time who's available in free agency that you have to have, right? And I think it's funny because you look back and so Cook might get 10 million. He might not. I mean, the fact is the post June 1 stuff, which by the way, if you go to sumersports.com and look at our article on post June 1 signings, Chase Falvey, one of your former cap guys, did a good job helping me, very sharp, very good at kind of discerning some of these things. But for those that don't know, like post June 1 is a big date because if a guy has a lot of bonus proration on his contract, if you trade him before June 1st, all of that contract proration accelerates onto your cap. Meaning if he had, like, let's say he had a $9 million signing bonus and you're 2 years in, those $6 million, as opposed to being spread out 3-3-3, that 6 that's left over would accelerate onto your cap. So oftentimes cutting or trading a player actually costs more than keeping them if it's pre-June 1. If it's post-June 1, if you trade a player, the dead money, other than this year's dead money, other than this year's, proration, all gets lumped into next year. So you're sort of pushing it off into the future. And if the cap goes up, that means that the actual, like the real value of those dollars goes down. So it's very smart to do that. The problem for the Vikings and Cook specifically is that they thought he'd have a bigger market in the trade market. So they kind of waited until June 1st to get the extra cap savings. But then a team like you talk about Miami. We talked about this on the Sumer Sports Show. Go to our YouTube page and watch it. But Devin Akane, the running back that they drafted, very similar to Cook. Not as good, of course, but very similar. And so because of the finances of his contract, the fact that you could not trade him pre-June 1 for the maximum savings meant that the Vikings had to wait that entire offseason. And the deck of cards changed. The Dolphins drafted a runner, so on and so forth. And Cook becomes less viable to the Dolphins because they have more, horses in the stable, if you will.
Well, you projected a lot of this. I remember back last year we were talking about the Vikings, although positive about one of your main teams, knowing that they're going to have to make some complicated decisions, right? And knowing that it might bite them in the ass. We'll see how it all plays out. Do you think this is the start of what we're talking about, or not even the start? Where do you think the Vikings are right now with regard to your projections about being a complicated building process?
Yeah, so season win total in the betting market is 8.5 wins. One of the things that you are going to get, by the way, with the Sumer Sports subscription when it comes out in August and September is our simulation. Our simulation has them at 7.9 wins, which is a little bit under that, and a few reasons, right? So they were really lucky last year. They had 13 wins, but as you know, some of those wins were, fluky 60-yard field goals and missed field goals by their opponents and interceptions and stuff. And so they had a point differential of a team that was more like an 8-win team, an 8.5, 9-win team. And so there's part of that. There's also the part to your point where, none of this is Adolfo Mensa's fault. And frankly, I don't necessarily put a lot of this at the feet of Rick Spielman. I think a lot of people, when they get close, like the NFC title game, they'll go all in. And that's what they did. But a lot of those contracts, to your point, became messy. Mm-hmm. We talked about Danielle Hunter on this show a couple weeks ago as well. And so they're just having to make hard decisions. And a lot of times we talk about this it's COVID-19 or it's health or all this kind of stuff. There isn't a good decision to make. None of the options are great. I don't think Kwesi wanted to cut Dalvin Cook, right? But keeping Dalvin Cook was probably worse, right? So that you're choosing between two bad options, the better one. And I think unfortunately the way that their cap situation is, that's going to have to happen. What do they do with Danielle Hunter? Danielle Hunter only has $5.5 million of new money on his deal this year. It's a double-digit sack guy, an amazing athlete, great player. I shouldn't say amazing. You were going to call me on that.
Yeah, I was going to call you on that.
A good football player. Let's at least go there. But because of the way that they had to maneuver his contract, he's $13 million against their cap this year, but he's only getting paid $5.5. So that's going to cause some tension, right? And so Kwesi's got to deal with a lot of, Justin Jefferson's up for a new deal. TJ Hawkinson's up for a new deal. So when I think about their team, they're still good players. They got two really good tackles. They have a wide receiver who may be the best player in football at that position. They have a tight end who's done really well since being traded there. And they have a quarterback that's good enough to win them, evidently, 10 or more games. And so it's hard for them to completely blow it up. But at the same time, given all their defections on defense and all their difficulties with the cap, it's hard for me to project them as being some sort of favorite in the NFC.
And you can see, everyone, my guy's just bleeding purple here because he's so passionate. Well, it's funny because there's purple coming out and then there's red and kind of yellow. I can't really figure out where your commitments are, but I love it. I love the passion.
Yeah. And what do you think about Hopkins? So Hopkins entered the league kind of a couple years after you drafted Julio. They were kind of together, top, if you were making a list of top 5 wide receivers, Julio and DeAndre Hopkins made that list frequently, if not the whole time. Right. And the problem with Hopkins, and this is one, again, I'm very close to people I'm a Chiefs fan, and I'm close with people who cover the Chiefs and all that stuff. And Hopkins has been rumored to go to Kansas City. The problem is Kansas City, and this is maybe something that you can opine on because I think a lot of our listeners maybe don't understand this distinction. The Chiefs can make the cap space for Hopkins, but it's going to require a lot of upfront cash that they have historically not doled out before. And what I mean by that is they have about they have very little cap space, but they can open up the 10 to 15 million that Hopkins wants by extending Chris Jones, getting his number from 28 down to whatever. They can extend, or not extend, but they can renegotiate Mahomes' deal and get some of that prorated or some of that signing what do they call it? Like a roster bonus, and turn it into a signing bonus and prorate that. The problem is, Thomas, every time you do that as an NFL team, the owner has to put that money in escrow, which is not necessarily something I think Chiefs ownership, who is, and they're not cheap and they're not poor and they're not cash poor and all this stuff. But when you look at league-wide spending, the Chiefs are always in the bottom third of the league. And so when people look and say, oh, they can make the space, and this is true, Buffalo, all these teams that want Hopkins, I think you have to look further into the cash considerations and why he hasn't been signed yet.
Well, let me ask you this. You said the third bottom of the league, you're saying? You're saying they spend the most?
The least.
The least. Okay. I just want to, when you say the third bottom, we're always looking at our charts knowing that we were way down there because we spent for Arthur Blank. Literally take care of this the company, take care of the community. And it's interesting because when you talk about Kansas City with a player, let's first talk about Hop, right? Do you think Hopkins does he still have it in him to be a difference maker on the field? And you said 10 to 15. Do you think he's going to walk away with $12 million? Like, is that really what he wants as a year and then with some upside? Okay. Was that number really 10, the little upside to get to 12?
Does it matter at this point? Because I think, and one thing that's really hurting him is I know of multiple teams that had 1 year, $5 million on the table for Odell, right?
Yeah.
And that wasn't, he wasn't doing that. But the Ravens, who have struggled, I mean, you look at their wide receiving core, they have struggled to both have healthy receivers, Rashad Bateman's been injured a lot, and productive receivers for so long that the Baltimore kind of came up over, in poker, you'd say, come up over the top. They came up over the top and gave Beckham 15 to 8, depending on how you look at it. And that was just to get Beckham into the building and working out with Lamar and all this. It was also to get Lamar. We forget about this. The NFL offseason is so long, but Lamar was on, on the outs with Baltimore for a while. You come up over the top to get him into the building, right? So that he stops mulling. I got a bunch of different offers on the table. You come up over and 3x those offers, and he comes in, right? Hopkins, I believe, from what I've listened, from my kind of probably has a bunch of 1 year, $8 million, 1 year, $10 million offers on the table. And he's holding out for that 17.5 to 20 million, to your point. And I just don't think it's coming. When you look at the salary cap space across the league, it's simply not there. And when you look at, that's a crazy stat I looked up, but after Kyler Murray got injured, he did not catch one pass against man coverage last year.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I'm thinking to myself, and you look at like 23% of his targets are contested. Like he's got a type, right? And how does that type, when you're not necessarily the everything everywhere all at once wide receiver anymore? And we could say at 31 he might not be. Like, does he fit in? The fit has to be good.
Well, I mean, so are you still holding on hope for the fact that Kansas City would do something versus New England? Because we're talking about New England. We're talking about a very, very much like the Hunts, right? I like Clark Hunt a lot. I think he's such a very thoughtful person with his approach, as is Bill Belichick in my mind. These are two people that would obviously benefit from a guy like this. How long do they push it out there? Where do you think he would go in the end? I mean, we can throw this around, right? He wants to be a part of a contender. I continue to hear that, right? Do you think both of those teams are contender? Yes, I do think. And I'll put words in your mouth because I'm a favorite. One of my favorites is New England. I think they're always a contender. Sorry for those people out there that aren't fans of that, but I do believe so. They're always going to be in it. They'll always feel like they'll get something done. And I'm just wondering, how far do you put that off, right? I didn't see that bottom line there. You could read it out to me.
Yeah, we have our friend Jason Fitzgerald from Over the Cap. This is the Over the Cap, our friend here. Frame of reference, post June 1, top street wide receiver contracts have been Antonio Brown at 15.25, Julio last year at 6, Macklin at 5.5. I forgot when the Chiefs cut Macklin in June, and Eric Decker at 4. I forgot that the Chiefs cut Macklin 2 years into that deal. And made Tyreek Hill their number one receiver, which in hindsight, was very smart. Macklin went to Baltimore after that for not much at all. Julio, Julio's had his, you know him better than anybody. Yeah. But even with him, age was the thing. I remember 2 years ago, or 3 when he went to Tennessee. A lot of Chiefs Kingdom, as we call them, were calling for the Chiefs to trade for Julio. And it's just when you look at the history, like these teams, and there are a lot of teams that just don't like old players, especially when you have to give up more than like the vet minimum for them. And Antonio Brown's an interesting case as well, because you're talking about a first ballot guy if he doesn't have his off the field stuff, and he was not let go because of talent or anything other than some of his shenanigans, right? So that one's kind of weird. I think it's closer to Julio and Macklin, maybe not Macklin, but it's closer to Julio than it is Antonio Brown at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest so. And remember, these GMs right now, when you think about it, they start looking at all the things that are involved here, right? Not only the playing that a lot of the analytic people do, right? That we've talked about this so many times, and I hate to bore people with it, but you're a general manager and things are rolling, but you have some heat starting up here, right? I'm not saying in any way Kansas City does, of course. And I mean, the Bill stuff, I just dismiss that. But whatever it is, you also have to look your owner in the eye, and you have to say he's got, these things that are outstanding right now. I mean, we have injury stuff, we have some character stuff that they're dealing with, right? Do you really want to step out? It's a little easier to step out at $10 million than it is to step out at 16, 17, right? Call it
the expectations, right? Like when you give a player a contract, they come with expectations. And when you give a guy, I mean, you think about Kansas City, like right now they have Sky Moore and Rashee Rice are second round picks. Kadarius Toney's a first round pick that they traded for. Marquez Valdez-Scantling's their highest paid receiver at like 10, 12 million. You bring in Hopkins at 15. That guy's your number one, right? From the perspective of the dollars. And you think, like, do you want that to be part of? There's one side of it where you can say, okay, my general manager wants to win. That's great. But the other part of it is like, you're going to battle with this roster, and then some other guy comes in. It doesn't feel the greatest. So I think that there are two competing factors there too, right?
And I think the other thing is, like, again, I mentioned many times my good friend John Robinson, he brought in Julio Jones thinking that Julio was going to be an easy fix at a good price, right? When you talk about $6 million. And yet there's another side of that. All of a sudden, it kind of falls by the wayside, and you are once again judged by your move, right? $6 million or 16 million. Yes, there's a difference there, of course, but you're still darted on it, right? Why are you bringing in a guy like this that has a history of being injured? Or why are you bringing in a guy like this that has a history of kind of maybe pulling off a little bit because he's just not necessarily interested in what's going on, or things aren't going his way? He's no longer the number one. I mean, Julio in his day was the dude. John brings him in there, and of course, he wasn't the dude there. He could still do some fantastic things. All I'm saying, when you start dealing with receivers, and I'm not saying all receivers, there's a definite ego there. We all know that. How do you navigate it? I would come back to saying what I've always said. Bill Belichick is the master at taking egotistical receivers who might be on the tail end or could turn the other way, meaning it's time to go, and yet he brings them back for 2 or 3 more years because he has a real special way of doing that. I'm not saying Andy Reid can't do it, because I think Andy Reid can do it as well. Point is, 2 ideal teams involved in a guy like this. We haven't even talked about Dalvin Cook, but when we're talking about receiver, these are 2 guys that are going to get the most out of this guy, I think.
Yeah, this is a really good question from Jack_OSU. On the Odell signing, can the Ravens turn any of that contract payment over future void years? Or is that only for multi-year deals? No, this is another important deal when you're talking about trying to predict where guys will go. The Ravens signed Odell technically to a 5-year deal, but it's a 1-year deal with 4 void years. And the first year has a 1.165 base, which is the league minimum. The rest of it is prorated over a 13.835 bonus. So that's 2.7 or so years over 5. So they're spreading it out. Now, the Chiefs have never done a void year deal before, right? So they've never, and even with Donovan Smith, they didn't do that. Even with, some of the Carlos Dunlap last year, they've never, and again, it's good. And I know this is something I've learned from Jason at Over the Cap. It's like, it's good to go through and see, like, oh, historically, for example, the Bucks never gave out signing bonus. They just paid as they went. Whereas other teams like the reason spending is important is because some of these teams spend and they just push money in the future, and they're always, kind of near the top of the spending rankings, like Cleveland, where they'll just give out bonuses and prorate them out, and some teams don't. And it's good to go back and see, like, and the Ravens, in the case of Odell, like, actually change what they do. That was one of the first ones that they've ever done of that ilk. Some teams have yet to do that still, and it's important to, like, when you're making a prediction, to say, would they actually do something like that?
Well, a little aside here, this is a great topic. Most teams, every team has a philosophy on how they're going to approach the cap, right? How they're going to approach their payments, what they're going to do, what they aren't going to do. We used to have a spreadsheet this long. Nick Polk and Chase Falvey used to work on all the time. It was beautiful. I loved it. Some of that stuff, interestingly enough, was a carryover from the Falcons paradigm before I got there, right? Ideas that Rich McKay and that Arthur Blank really stood firmly by, and our financial people did. And then, I brought certain things from I would say from New England that we would consider. And then Nick Polk and Chase would talk to me a lot about, hey, have you thought about doing this and this? Let's see how it looks on this great spreadsheet and see how it all plays out, right? Now that changes. It can change from year to year. It can change over 6 years. Some stuff we had on that basically guideline sheet that we had since I got there for almost 13 years or 12 years. Other things started falling by the wayside. The reason I bring that up is it's not just whimsically, hey, we're going to do it this year this way and we're going to do it this year. Some people get so stuck in their ways and they don't step back and take a deep breath and think, why am I not looking into this? I would suggest, honestly, we were late to the party. Nick's going to probably get pissed off at me. Nick Polk is, but we were late to the party on our whole compensatory approach, right? A little aside again. We just kept doing things the way that we were doing them, and we probably should have adjusted. Back to this. Do you have a really firm grasp of what you think your beloved Chiefs do? Do you know what they, I mean, you mentioned a couple things here and there. Do you know there are certain things they wouldn't do to get a deal done?
I don't think that they would use void years. I don't think that they're going to use void years. And I think that we talked about this a long time ago on this show. They have to consider what to do with Chris Jones. And again, Chris Jones, like when you're talking, and again, it's funny because we think about the cap and I want to praise Jason and Over the Cap. I want to praise generally the football intelligentsia. I think this show contributes to it as well. Where like we are so much smarter about team building as a public now than we used to be. And yet I think one of the drawbacks of that is we're all cap focused. Oh, they can make the money work. We watched the Saints for years and years, push everything in the future and make it work. We have to consider the cap considerations. If they give Chris Jones a contract extension, that thing's going to have, $60 million guaranteed. If it's similar to similar to the market, that's $60 million, the owner, and it does decrease their cap because it will make his cap number, far less. And it can, but so you're going to tell me that the Hunts are going to put $60 million in escrow for the right to put $15 million more onto a guy like Hopkins, who is not, if you look at contested catcher, he's just not their kind of wide receiver. So I don't see it. I do see New England possibly doing it because New England hasn't won a playoff game since 2018. And Bill Belichick has a legacy, and Tom Brady won a Super Bowl, and Belichick's the best coach that's ever lived. But there's a competitive nature to guys like that. They want to get back. And I think that's going to outweigh it. If you're Kansas City, you've just won a Super Bowl in a year where you just traded your best wide receiver to the Miami Dolphins. And and it's the same thing like Buffalo. I could see Buffalo doing it. I don't think Buffalo can maneuver enough cap and cash to do it. But Buffalo's in a different ilk. Buffalo's just as good as the Chiefs are, fundamentally, I think. Like if you grade the players, if you grade the rosters, they're just as good. They have 2 fewer rings over the last 5 years. That's going to, this is like you coached you were the GM for one of the best teams in the NFL for a half a decade twice. And like you got close a few times, and that changes the way that you go through and try to acquire players. If you have a ring in your back pocket, you can be a little bit more kind of like, I'm just going to let this thing play out. It's different, right? For teams other than the Chiefs.
No, you definitely can. Which, look, we could talk about D Hopkins for as long as the show because it's a passionate discussion. beyond him. You and I have been talking a lot about this lately as well, though, Eric, and that is from my perspective as a GM, former GM, and how I would do things differently, and what if I were ever to be able to be in that seat again. I can't even say it. Listen to me stumbling. Who would I have? Who would I have beside me? Who would I work closely with? How would I approach it from a statistical, analytical standpoint, an advanced analytical standpoint? And we were talking about Dalvin Cook. We're talking about running backs. We had some luck with running backs in the past. I had some, marginal luck with running backs. If you start talking about, metrics that measure a running back, right? And you're talking to me, and you and I are working together at an organization. We have to sell this to the owner. But they want something that is much bigger than just me saying, look, I saw him on tape. He does this, this, and this, right? Let's call it that way. Let's do the little division of analytics versus old school football. Can you talk to me a little bit about leading in on that from a running back standpoint?
Yeah, because I think, and this will dovetail into our discussion of quarterbacks too, but it's everything you want to do from an analytical standpoint is trying to mimic what a scout is doing in some ways, right? Because Dean Oliver has a great quote. Dean Oliver is an assistant coach, I think, for the Sacramento Kings. He was one of the pioneers of basketball analytics. He wrote the book Basketball on Paper. And he said something really good. He goes, a scout can watch a game better than I can, but my stats can watch all the games at once. And I think that is like, when I think about that, and I think about saying that to you, and I think about saying that to our scouts, and what that means is a scout should be sitting next to an analytics person and deriving and building these metrics for with us. And the biggest thing you're doing, and let's talk about running backs for a second, we'll move on to quarterbacks, because we do have some questions from the web that I think are very good. But when you're looking at a running back, let's say a running back that's playing for Alabama, who's got all the advantages in the world, the offensive line, the wide receivers, the quarterbacks, the play caller, all that are an advantage for him. Mm-hmm. And he rushes for 7 yards a carry. That 7 yards a carry to somebody like you and to somebody like me is not that meaningful, right? Because you have to take into account all the things that gave rise to that 7 yards. So the blocking, the down and distance, right? So I talked about this the other day with like Mike Allstott or whatever. It was like, and Warwick Dunn, where it was like, where it was, Mike Allstott averaged like 3.7. I can't remember exactly, but Mike Allstott and Warwick Dunn averaged 2 different yards per carry, right? And ultimately, Mike Allstott ran a lot of short yardage plays, which are going to have lower expectation than Warwick Dunn, who ran a lot of like long yardage plays. Yeah. Let's keep talking about running backs here. So the idea is that like, there are different expectations that go into what a performance is for a player. And you want to be able to, in what's called a residual metric, which is basically saying the outcome is a combination of the player and the expectation that the player doesn't control. Math is there to try to find the expectation that the player doesn't control, and the residual is the difference, right? Okay. So just even be like very, very crude here. So for example, if it's 1st and 10, the average rush on a 1st and 10 is 4.2 yards, let's say, and you get 5 yards, then you're going to be 0.8 yards over expectation is the idea. And if you are running on 1st and 10 and you're constantly getting 3 yards, you're always going to be 1.2 yards less than expected. And whereas if you have a different running back, let's say a short yardage guy, and it's 3rd down and 1, and the average 3rd down and 1 carry nets 3.5 yards, and he's constantly getting 4 yards, then he's going to be above that. But you have to change the expectation, because and you add more variables to it. So for example, how many men are in the box? People measure that now. PFF does, the charting data does, or the tracking data does. How many, the big data bowl had, how good are the blocks, right? Like where are the guys positioned, right? That's a pretty good. And so residual metrics essentially try to take all of the information that we know and come up with what would an average player achieve on those? And then it takes what does this player get and subtracts them. Now, what I think would be awesome for a community is for folks like you and people who are really good at evaluating these things to inform people like me as to how to build that expectation better.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I'm following you. Again, I've told you time and again, if you were to be in this situation 2 years from now with where we're going and how advanced we are becoming in general, and I'm sitting there listening, I'm like, okay, I'm back at my vids, I'm watching closely, and I'm thinking, hearing everything you're talking about, and yet I realize we're evaluating this player and we're trying to decide whether he's worth $10 million a year or $7 million or $8 million or $12 million, right? I'm just talking a running back.
Yep.
And I realize as I'm watching, I'm like, God, this guy is really good, man. I love his balance. I love his athleticism, quick twitch, explosiveness, all the stuff that we've talked about, the football stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then I start reading the numbers, and the numbers might not be as good as they may show, or be better, whatever. But let's say in this case, they aren't. And then I start watching closer, and I start watching how horseshit, God, did I just say that? I'm sorry. How horse crap. Yeah, how horse crap that right guard and that right in the center is, how they're comboing, and it's taking away from this guy's game. And it's not only this game. For some reason, there's a streak with that O-line, and then there's been an injury. All of a sudden, we are taking the numbers of this running back for over a span of 4 or 5 games that have a lot more involved, folded into it than just the pure number. This ends up being an issue for football people sometimes. What I'm looking for you is to say, help me with it. So if I'm sitting there going, God, this guy is better than this, Eric, this guy is expected, he is exponentially better. You're like, well, the numbers are saying this. And I'm saying, well, watch this video. Lame blocking for 4 games in a row puts him in a different spot.
Oh, 100%. And then that's, I think, where the progress happens, right? Because, take the NFL Fast Start version, the publicly available version of like CPOE, which we'll talk about quarterback at the very end, because I think there's some good examples. But like CPOE, for example, the quarterback version, completion percentage over expected, the only variable that includes offensive line directly is if the quarterback was hit or not. But clearly there are, things. And the same thing is true. Like, I think, and PFF does this, True Media does this, our friend John Tiramina there, like basically what I probably would want would be, you would want a readout of all of the individual plays, the numbers from the individual plays and how they add up. And then you would say, Eric, this is a play where I would have graded him very, very well, and you guys gave him a bad score. Yeah. And then we go in and be like, okay, it's 1st and 10. There's 8 men in the box. It's the score differential influences it, because when you're behind by a lot, it's harder. It's easier to run. When you're ahead by a lot, it's harder to run. All the stuff that you know as a football guy. And it's like, but then there's like, well, this is where you're missing. The right guard and the right tackle are awful. Where is that in your model? And then I'll say it's not. And then you'll say, well, you either have to come up, this is where it's all about the art versus the science. Mm-hmm. If I say, where are the right tackle and the right guard in the model? And you say, they're not. Where's the differential between offensive line and defensive line grades? They're not there. Well, okay. Well, then you're going to say something like, well, I'm sorry. I love the effort here, but it's not good enough to tell me what I need to know. You know what I'm saying?
Are you going to be able to factor in scheme? For instance, we had this forever when we were in Atlanta, and we started falling down by the wayside with our run game, because we kept stressing the outside zone where guys, we just wanted to start running. I mean, look, what Arthur Smith is doing with the Falcons now, I keep saying he's doing a hell of a job with them, right? They're running some strong downhill football, running plays. So, I mean,
those are linemen, by the way, Lindstrom and McGarry, who did not great. And again, we're all like anchored to some modern analytics. Hopefully, with Sumer and stuff, we can get to a different place. But like McGarry and Lindstrom never graded that well at first, and now they grade really well. What's contributing to that? Is it age? Is it scheme? To your point, like outside zone plays, they have more holding penalties called on them than other plays, right? So even if a guy does a really good job, jams his foot in the ground and gets upfield for 15 yards, that might be called back. That's gonna people laugh at this kind of stuff, but 15 yards taken off of a ledger in an average game is 1 yard per carry in that game, because they gained 15 carries, right? So like it's all this little, like, it's funny. I was at a bar once arguing with somebody over baseball, and they were like, oh, you can tell way more with your eyes. And it's like, well, actually, like the difference between a 275 hitter and a 300 hitter is like one hit every 2 weeks, which you're not going to be able to discern, right? So it's one of those where what we need is the good eyes informing the math, and then the math coming back and informing the good eyes and the cycle. And to your point, like there might be some situations where you're like, well, I need this data point. And I'm like, well, we don't have it. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to deal with that then in some way, either collect new data or evaluate data differently, whatever. But that's got to be the conversation. And I think like through those really intelligent conversations and through that trust comes actual, like if you and I were interacting, I'm like, look, I don't like this running back. His ROI, rush yards over expected, sucks. And you're like, well, to the point of like Ryan just said, and this is probably a well-informed view, Gibbs didn't have all the advantages at Alabama. I wasn't even thinking of Gibbs. I was thinking of like Najee Harris. But like mid O-line, mid coaching, which I don't think is true. No other quality skill position players. Gibbs had the hardest running back role of the Saban era. Still super productive. Great, right? Like we got to be able to codify that, right? We got to be able to put that into an algorithm. And then what's going to end up happening is the game is going to change. And this is where I want to talk for the last like 5 or 6 minutes about completion percentage over expected. Now, I'm going to put a graph on the table on the board. I'm going to one of my colleagues is going to, as well as you are going to say, I got to explain the axes here.
Please.
CPOE is basically saying for every single throw, I'm going to say, what does the average quarterback do as far as completing this pass? So let's say it's a 15-yard pass down the middle of the field in between the hashes with no pressure. What's the percentage of passes are complete on those plays? And then over time, you either complete more or less than expected, and that's in terms of a percentage. So on this x-axis, for example, Mahomes in 2022 completed about 3.5% more passes than you would expect. Whereas Baker Mayfield, my guy, completed 7% fewer passes than you would expect from a similar player. Now, on the y-axis is what's called expected points per pass play. And scrambles and stuff like that. So this is basically how many points per play is this offense generating through the passing game. More points is better, worse points is. So again, and what's cool is like these two metrics kind of jive with each other. Like if the line slopes upward, that means being an accurate passer is good for your offense. Now it's not perfect. And I think where the imperfections come in is really where an interaction like yours and mine can really shine, because you look at, for example, Geno Smith is completing almost 6% more passes on per pass but his expected point, that offense isn't that much more productive than average, right? Whereas there are other guys, Garoppolo is not that accurate relative to average, but that offense is amazing, right? Because of Shanahan and the receivers and the yak and stuff. So there's very clearly holes in this metric and why it can't stack players. We got a really cool question from Colin Dunphy on Twitter who said, to what extent does CPOE describe or evaluate how a player plays? I think it describes how a player plays, not how well a player plays in some ways. Like if you are, I think it's an incomplete metric for a few reasons. And I think it's because of the stuff that somebody like you could see, but I couldn't see with just my numbers. Like I personally think that CPOE is a flawed metric because there are quarterbacks through pocket maneuvering, through, or through the coaching or whatever, engineer passes that are easier to complete than other quarterbacks. And so their CPOE is not going to be as high because they're expected to complete more passes. So when they complete just a little bit above that, they're not considered that good. Whereas I think there are other quarterbacks who don't necessarily engineer easy throws for themselves. I think about like Kirk Cousins. I think about Derek Carr. I think about guys like that who just kind of stand in the pocket and throw what's there, but they're accurate. So they complete a lot of passes more than expected, but they're not that effective because if they were really, truly great quarterbacks, Thomas, they would move around in the pocket and find the best pass, not the hardest pass.
Okay, let me ask you this then. We're sitting there, you and I are sitting there, or I am sitting there with someone that has your background and your makeup, and you're pitching me CPOE. Let's just talk about the two of us. And we're looking at a quarterback on a new organization that hires us, hypothetically, right? You're supposed to smile at that, but let's just say
I'm fine. Sorry, But people want timestamps for the show, so I've been kind of like marking them randomly. I know that's so anyway, but I yes, I smirked at that a little bit, Thomas.
Well, look, so we're going in there and we're like, you know what? We have a whole scouting department, we have a whole coaching department. That said, as a general manager, I want to sit down with my guy. I want to sit down and I want to take our stack on the board of 5 quarterbacks and really hone in here with CPOE. And I'm talking about the what is that exercise. I want you to maybe educate everyone in the last couple minutes. How does that person come in and prove to the general manager it's worthy of his time to have the very intelligent person with a very strong mathematical brain to help me differentiate between the 5? Because I have some very strong opinions about how that 5 should be stacked. Is the CPOE truly doing that for – go ahead.
No, I don't think so. I mean, my thing is I think CPOE tells you what kind of quarterback it is. And except in the cases like the really bad cases like Mayfield or Mills or Wentz, guys like that, like I don't think it's like, and Mahomes too is better than that, but I think it breaks ties. Or I think, and maybe this could be a better thing. It's if you have a tie between 2 quarterbacks, I think CPOE can tell you which one you want to take for the offense that you're in. So like if I'm the current Falcons, let's get to brass tacks here. And the current Falcons, I don't think this is a mystery, want their quarterback just to pick up the dollar bills off the ground. Like they're not asking their quarterback to be Matt Ryan. They're not asking their quarterback to be, they're asking their quarterback, look, we're going to run for 6 yards a carry. That's what they want to do, right? You're going to get some 1st and 10s or you're running play action, and there are going to be guys wide open. You need to hit those guys in the chest, right? If the Falcons are in a lot of 3rd and 7s this year, they're not winning, right? Like because of the way that they've constructed, they want to get to 2nd and 3. They want to get to 1st and 10 all the time, and then the quarterback's there to kind of hit the passes that are wide open. If that is my team, I'm going to look at CPOE a lot different than if I'm like the Los Angeles Chargers that put a lot on their quarterback's plate and say, you're here to engineer good. You're here to engineer your throws and complete them. And that's, I think, when we talk about residual metrics, why CPOE fails, in my opinion, sometimes is the expectation should be independent of who the player is. Like you should not be able to engineer it. Like there was, so the next gen stats version of CPOE actually tracks receiver separation as one of the variables. In theory, if you're throwing to wide open receivers, you should get dinged for that is the point. But what happens, you might remember this game. I don't know where, but it was in 2020, the Chiefs were playing at Raiders during the pandemic, and Mahomes threw a game-winning touchdown pass to Kelsey where he rolled out and took the whole defense with him, threw back across his body. Kelsey's wide open, right? The act that Mahomes had to make that throw wide open is him. And yet in that metric, you're going to say, well, no, it was an easy throw. No, he made the throw easy, right? And so it's the same thing with running backs too. It's like, and I think we're very bad at this, by the way. If all the young analytics people that want a job at Sumer figure out how to do this, and we'll hire you. But like for running backs, it's more about setting up your blocks, right? Like I remember there are some running backs, like I think about how Thomas Jones played forever. And I think about how Frank Gore played forever and Curtis Martin played forever. Those guys were not athletic at the end, but they set up blocks so well that I even think CPOE would fail to measure them because the blocks, the table that was set for them was partly set by them. And so I think when you build these metrics, you have to be very open about what you're putting in that expectation. And if that includes the player, it's going to be a little bit invalid.
So, and we'll finish with this because I'd love you to cap it off. But again, these are the kind of things that we need as Sumer Sports. You all need, who are, data scientists out there and data engineers. We need to continue to educate the football people in the NFL and in the NCAA, because there are all kinds of opportunities in my mind. as a guy who's been raised in this sport forever, we want it to go this way. We want it, and we know it's evolving, right? So continue to come to the table with elements that are going to help. Like you said, it's going to differentiate between maybe A and B. It's not going to outline your entire, quarterback group that is maybe 50 deep. I don't believe, right? All I'm saying in the end is continue to bring people along, show them where the benefits are on something like this. And I think we're well on our way. But I love what we're doing at Sumer in many ways without getting into a ton of it. I love these conversations that I have with you. This goes all the way back to, years ago when we first started hanging out, even when I was still with Atlanta, and now where we are right now when you're kicking your feet up everywhere around here in this beautiful office and you're pontificating about all your intelligentsia. I love it because I think
hopefully Neil's listening to this. Hornsby, the former CEO, the founder of PFF, because I did this. I actually am much better at the Sumer offices than I was at the old PFF offices, but that's kind of where I'm. Jack says, any estimate for a Sumer analytics subscription? We're still bouncing, very affordable for people. Hopefully by the time it gets there, look at the space in August and September for that. We're not going to be charging you $100 a month. Let's just put it out that way. No, I think the big thing is, and this is about mutual respect, right? I mean, the times that we've met, like, look, all the trade charts in the world would have told you not to trade for Julio Jones, right? Like that's and yet, like when we first met, like the whole point is the Julio Jones trade was a hit, like to not, and so there's clearly something that you saw that would not have been in it. And maybe it's noise, maybe it's not, but like the whole part is analytics people and scout people, people who scout, like they need to have the comfort with the other side, for lack of a better term, to be naked about the problems with their approaches, right? With scouts, you could say a bunch of things. Like you're not able to watch all the games. You don't have enough time. You have you have some positions you do well, some you don't. All that stuff. And then the analytics side has to say, look, there are some stuff we don't account for. And if that's integral to how you're building a team, well, these metrics are going to be useless or less useful. And until you're able to say that, right, then we're going to be talking past each other. And I think that one of the things about this podcast and one of the things about our relationship and one of the things about Sumer is you got to be able to have that communication, because otherwise, and I know it can hurt. Like I know that you can spend all this time scouting a player and think he's amazing and all of the metrics say no, or you can spend all this time building an algorithm, unit testing, building a package, all that stuff that all my guys are doing right now. And the guy could be like I remember, and I'll end with this. I remember my second year in grad school, I built a model and proved a theorem about a certain plant. I know. And I went to the biologist's office who was an expert, and I said, hey, nice to meet you. I'm Eric. I'm a grad student in the math department. I think I learned something about your plant. And she's like, well, honestly, you don't know the first thing about this thing. And like, it hurt, right? It hurt. All that work was like, and we ended up publishing papers together and working really well together. But in any interdisciplinary discussion, there's going to be these things. It's not going to be the perfect insert my knowledge into your knowledge. We have more knowledge thing. That's not how it works. It's thorny and it's difficult. And that's an important part to realize.
Well, I know you're finishing now, but you said it hurt twice. If anyone's watched the movie Chef out there, there's an amazing scene, and I'm going to send it to you. When he was in the restaurant and he was throwing that mud pie around or whatever it was.
Chef is by far the best airplane movie I've ever watched in my life. You
kind of got a little Devereaux. Is that his name? You kind of have a little bit.
Jon Favreau?
Favreau. Yes, Favreau. Not Devereaux. Favreau. Yes, you do. I saw him in Atlanta. Yeah. You guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the you've avoided this. You're in very good shape. But like as you get older and you gain 10, 15 pounds since your playing days, you start looking like Seth Rogen and Jon Favreau when you used to be a wide receiver. Now you're being compared to guys like that. I get it. But yeah, I mean, look, Favreau is amazing in that movie, by the way. Sofia Vergara, also a very good appearance by her, but she bats 1,000 in those movies. So awesome. Yeah, so we're basically done here. Sumersports.com. Go ahead, sign up for the newsletter, which will be coming out in the next month or so. Subscriptions will be coming out, fairly soon to the website, August, September, right in time for football. if you go to our YouTube page, please subscribe, please hit the like button. Also sign up for on the podcast feed wherever you get it. Tell somebody about the show because again, when we hit it big, you will be one of the first. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 72 of the Sumer Sports Show.